once again. It is the podcast for a Friday, and with me, as you can see if you are watching, but you will hear in a moment if you are listening, John Shannon at the bottom of the screen, and I believe to my right, because I think this all works backwards, our longtime friend and colleague, JP Morosi of MLB Network and a variety of other sundry things that he does to earn himself a fancy living. Morosi, you look beautiful. How are you?
Likewise, Bob and John, it is great to be with you both again. I hope you're doing great in this beautiful summer, and let's hope that we are getting ever closer to the safe return of the sports that we love so much here in North America. But more than anything, my friends, it's great to be talking with you in any circumstance.
Well, let's get right in that, because you said something that I think I would dispute, and I'm suspecting John will too, and that's the safe return of sports. We are literally a couple of weeks away from big-time sports returning in North America, albeit nobody in the stands. But while that is going on in your country, Morosi, the COVID numbers are increasing rapidly, and I believe yesterday was an all-time record, over 60,000 new positive tests. We are seeing virtually every day another league, another team, another sport announcing this guy tested positive, et cetera, et cetera. Boy, it is really hard to imagine that this is going to work, at least for all leagues. Aren't you of the opinion that at least one of them is going to crumble under this?
Well, we don't know, Bob, and I think that it's a question of the macro and the micro, and you're right. The overall situation is extremely concerning as the record number of positive tests continues. We've had a number of those record days in the last week, and that is objectively terribly concerning, I think, on the big picture. The question is, I think, for Major League Baseball, for the National Hockey League, for any sports league, is your business able to operate in a very narrow fashion in a way that mitigates a lot of the risk? And I think that is now the question before all the heads of the leagues, the players' unions, the players themselves. How can we do this? We have seen in North America, the NWSL, for example, the top women's league in North America, operating at their tournament in Utah, and they have done so very safely by any objective measure in terms of a relatively low number, and in fact, from what I can tell, zero number of positive tests in that league. MLS just now getting underway. And with MLB, we can say that, yes, there have certainly been a lot of positive tests on the intake testing, a number of them on various teams. It does seem as though so far from an operational standpoint, day to day, that there have not been very many, if any, new infections once the workouts have commenced as of last week. So it is going to be difficult. There's no question about that. But it does seem that over the last week, and we are only a week into this, that the players and the teams with MLB have done a very admirable job of adhering to the very strict protocols that are in play.
See, the key thing for me, John, in all this is, and it's a word Bob used right at the beginning, and that is safe. And you talked about the Women's Soccer League being in a single location. To me, when baseball plays in 30 locations, they're just asking for trouble. When you consider that so many guys like to take their time and enjoy their lifestyle in baseball, I think it's going to be impossible to try to manage this as they start to play. I mean, from hotel, in Toronto at Rogers Place, the hotel's part of the stadium, but that's not necessarily the case everywhere else. And let's face it, baseball players, like every other athlete, that every other man under the age of 35, they love to socialize. I think that this is going to be a huge challenge when you're not limiting the amount of locations they're playing in.
Well, let me get to that point, because I think it's valid, Morosi. Why do you believe that baseball went this route where the other leagues almost entirely decided on one or a few central locations where everybody goes to? Was this a critical mistake on baseball's part, in your opinion?
I don't think so, Bob and John, and I think a couple things. Number one, I believe the players wanted this format, the ability to, at least when you're playing at home, be with your family. And I think that's one fundamental difference between where MLB is with their schedule versus the NBA and the NHL. This is the playoffs for the NBA and the NHL. With MLB, it's the start of the regular season. And so it's a longer commitment to begin with. Whereas with the NHL, you consider the bubble, and depending on where your team is and how you do, you might be going home in a couple weeks. And so it's less of an overall commitment than with baseball, where the attitude is, listen, from the start of your training to the end of the World Series will be roughly 4 months if things go to their full completion. And I think that players wanted to be able to spend time with their families in the midst of that. And so I think that was a really significant part of what the players union wanted. As for the mechanics of traveling, and it's a fair question, a couple things I would say on that. Number one, from a standpoint of the science and what is safe relative to flying versus taking a bus or whatever it may be, there is still a lot that we don't know. And I'm not sure that, and obviously I'm not a doctor, my spouse is, but I'm not, that when you think about the risk inherent in it, I am not certain that flying in a plane in a socially distanced fashion with maybe not every seat being occupied and however you station the plane, I am not certain as we speak today that flying in a plane in a socially distanced manner throughout the airplane is manifestly more or less likely to cause infection than if you were riding in a bus or even occupying a clubhouse with that same group of people. I'm not really sure. I really don't know. And I think that one of the things I can tell you is, from having covered the Cubs' first workout at Wrigley Field last week, is that the testing, even for people like me, a reporter covering it, is detailed. I had a temperature check. I had to wear my mask the entire time I was inside Wrigley Field, inside or outside, in terms of whether it was indoors or outdoors. Once I'm in the facility, had to answer a questionnaire. This is a very strict situation. And one thing we do know, I think we've all come to see this in our coverage of sports in recent years, the modern athlete, I believe, is considerably more disciplined in his or her routine than the athlete would have been 15, 20 years ago. I think their overall habits, their understanding of nutrition, wellness, sleep, mental health, a lot of those components that make for a successful athlete, I think there's much greater awareness now than there was 20 years ago. And I believe that routine, and I talked with an executive yesterday who said the players and their adherence to things so far, and again, granted, it's just a week, but that it's been very strong, very strict. And we believe that, again, 1 week into this, that's been the reason why we have not heard of waves of additional positive tests beyond the additional intake testing.
Hey, John, does this help heal the very large wound between the Players Association and the Commissioner's office?
That's a great question, John. I think that it certainly could help from the standpoint of the common cause between the two parties, just getting this endeavor off the ground and operating successfully and in a healthy manner. I do think there is, because there has to be that collective effort. They have kind of come together out of necessity to find a way to make this work. I do think as well, John, that the overall connection that was made from a negotiating standpoint between either side in what was happening the last several months and what might happen at the end of 2021, I think was a bit of a stretch to begin with. The notion that in the midst of everything happening, that if one side or the other held to this stance or another in the negotiating here, as it related to percentage of salary or prorated salary, that's going to manifestly affect an offer that's going to happen in 12 months about the luxury tax or draft pick compensation, I think all along was a stretch. I don't really think at all that MLB is going to make a calculation based on what the union did in the last several months and adjust their first proposal in a year from now. I don't really believe that's reality. I think these are very separate negotiations, This one was about some very specific circumstances to the present time in which we live, whereas the future is about a whole different set of economic parameters that I think are in some ways only tangentially related to what we're dealing with right now.
Outside of the balloon or the bubble that is created for something like the NBA in one central location, the NHL, I presume, in 4 locations. Now, like, forget the hotels attached at the Dome here in Toronto to the stadium. You're landing at an airport. You've got baggage people. You've got there's all kinds of people that you have to come in contact with just to get you from the airport to your hotel. Then you're trusting that player to stay isolated, stay in his room, et cetera, et cetera. It just seems to me that there is an inevitability here that something bad's going to happen somewhere, which then raises the question: what's the bar in determining whether we keep going? And I think John and I'll throw it to you, Shannon. I mean, I think we've talked about this several times before. I think there's a real danger that at some point, at least one team and probably multiple teams is going to be in a position where they're going to have to determine or have it determined for them whether they can continue, yes or no.
Well, we've already seen that with the MLS in their bubble in Orlando with at least
Dallas,
one, possibly right? 2 teams. Dallas, yeah, for sure has opted out. They've had to redo the schedule already based on that for the soccer league. I think in many ways, though, this is on the players to make that decision. This is, in the end, safety is about the players' safety and their long-term health. And you can have a commissioner saying that yes, we're going to play. You can have teams being adamant, but in the end, if the players aren't fully supportive, that's where I think the difference is going to be. If you get a team, whether it's in baseball or in hockey or basketball, where you have 4 or 5 guys that are found positive, there's going to be an opt-out. There's going to be a team, and just as importantly, there could possibly be the opposition that's going to say, hey, we don't want to be involved. We don't want to play. So not only do you have the original team opting out, there's a good chance that you could have the team they were supposed to play tomorrow night opt out. And I think that's where this changes from regular governance of a professional sports league. This becomes on the onus of the players, and the players first.
Okay. Let's address it from this standpoint, because here's something we haven't talked about. And John, I'll throw it to you, or JP, I'll throw it to you. Can we presume that baseball might be safer than the other sports because of the proximity of the players to each other? To wit, in a baseball game, you don't really have to get that close. Yeah, the catcher's pretty close to the batter. But there are very few scenarios over a period of time where guys are in contact with each other. It's essentially a non-contact sport. Basketball, you got 10 guys on the floor. They're banging into each other every time they turn around. Hockey, I mean, at least in hockey, John, they could wear shields.
Right.
A lot of players do, and that would help. But they're in contact with each other. JP, is baseball then maybe the safest of the sports for that reason?
I believe it is. At least of the 4 major sports, I think certainly soccer has some parallels to baseball in terms of the distancing at many times of a soccer game. But I do think baseball probably is the best of the 5, if you want to call the big 5 sports. I believe baseball does have that advantage. First of all, we know from many scientists, and this is fairly well established, outside is better than inside. We have all learned that. We all appreciate that, understand why. Outside better than inside. Summer better than winter. So those types of dynamics are in play here. And so from a baseball standpoint, as you go through the days, and I appreciate the question about the hub and the safety of the hub versus traveling among cities, I do think the way in which baseball has handled this, in many ways, actually perhaps allows them to hedge their risk a little bit, And specifically, I'll say this, if there's a series going on in San Francisco between the Giants and the Dodgers, and if a team playing on the East Coast has 3 positive tests for COVID-19, that really does not have that much bearing on the Dodger-Giant series 2,500 miles away. It's a fundamentally different situation. And so I think if you're in a bubble and and all the teams are staying at the same hotel and you have 3 positive tests, that affects the entire enterprise in a very proximate manner. Whereas the Mariners playing in Seattle would not have that much to do with a team that they're not even going to play, by the way, when you consider the way the schedule is set up, that you're staying with regional, divisional, almost quote unquote conference play, if you want to use the college term, what's happening here across the baseball schedule. So I think while there is some risk, certainly in traveling, as long as the hotel employees and the airplane employees are being tested on a routine basis, there is a way, I think, to minimize as much of the risk as possible, as long as everyone is wearing a mask, which it really appears to be, from my perspective, what I have seen. Players are adhering to the rules. They are doing what they're supposed to do. And I'll use the example in Cleveland. Franmil Reyes attended a 4th of July weekend party that did not involve masks or social distancing, and he was kept away from the stadium for a period of multiple days to make sure that he was going to test negative, at least for that period of time. So I really think, Bob and John, the positive nature of the peer pressure has been helpful. And I really think that the way the players have behaved so far is admirable. I'm not going to minimize the degree of difficulty here. This is a substantially difficult endeavor that everybody is involved in. But all we can do is watch how the players are conducting themselves every day. And so far, they have done so in a very positive and constructive manner. I'll add quickly that Ken Rosenthal wrote this recently at The Athletic. I think it's a very good point, that getting off to a good start becomes very important. Not just because it's 60 games and every game is magnified, but rather that if you are on a veteran team and you start 10-20, do you have players start to opt out around the 1st of September? Does the overall loyalty to the different protocols here, does it start to fray a little bit because your overall vision of what you're doing here, your sense of purpose, maybe starts to fray if you're out of the race in a very early time of a 60-game season? That to me is where, interestingly, I think being a young team in some ways is helpful, because the young teams here, and I think that the Blue Jays are certainly fitting into that category, the Mariners do as well, a team that's just sort of emerging from a rebuild and moving into a more competitive phase of their overall life cycle. There are jobs and spots to be earned and won for 2021. You have a great incentive, if you have not gotten your major contract yet, to stay in the bubble, to follow the directions, and to put forth your best effort, because you are playing for your livelihood at a time when the economic circumstances of the game and the industry are somewhat in doubt. There are tremendous incentives for young players right now that maybe do not exist if you're a player like, for example, David Price, opting out of this year. He's got a young family. He's already been paid a lot of money. He's already won a World Series championship. There is less at play for David Price in 2020 than a great many younger players.
Hey, JP, let's face it. The Tigers have opted out the last 2 years based on what you're talking about, the way they've played. I mean, it's not a question of going 10 or 20. When you go, what would they lose? 114 last year? I mean, they opted out a lot earlier last season than the 162 game schedule. So,
and yet they unlike the Red Wings.
Oh, hey. There's been a lot of questions I get on social media and other things about is there going to be an asterisk beside the Stanley Cup if it's won this way? A 60-game regular season for baseball, playoffs, World Series, asterisk?
Not for me. It's going to be judged, I think, within the context of the season. For me, guys, when you win the World Series or the Stanley Cup in the midst of a pandemic, of all the time you had to spend away from your family, all the sacrifices that you had to make, we always talk about that with the Cup every year, thinking about the sacrifices that a player has made to move away from home at the age of 16 and the journey through the minor leagues and all the bus rides. Those are all sacrifices that make the winning of it so special. And we have all seen sacrifices that are being made right now. I think whether it's in our own personal lives or that we're observing in professionals, and I think most importantly, those who are taking care of people who are sick and sustaining life in the sense of frontline grocery store workers, whatever it may be. There are sacrifices being made across society. And I think that for the players that win this, and it'll be remarkable to see whatever the celebration looks like in terms of what they're even able to do in terms of shaking hands or hugging or whatever it may be, that would be allowed whenever these sports wrap up. It's going to mean something special. Not quite the same thing as a 162 game journey, but it's going to mean something special to these players. And I think that for the emotion and the meaning of it, when we see that final game played in the World Series of the Cup final, the emotion on the faces of the players will tell us all that we need to know. Now, if someone hits 410 in baseball, will it mean the same thing as Ted Williams hitting 406? From a historical standpoint, no, it won't. But within the context of 60 games, it will be something we're celebrating. Will we put it in the same conversation as Ted Williams? I would not. But I also do not feel like we have to have an asterisk by it, because we all understand the context in which that mark was achieved.
Well, there are those of us who, look at a glass and say it's half full, and some say it's half empty. I know when it comes to baseball, you look at a glass, Morosi, and you say it's 100% full all the time. And I've lived with that my entire life.
I'm romantic, Bob.
Since I've known you. So, I get that poppycock that you're spewing. Here's the truth. The significance of the World Series, a World Series victory after a 60-game season, will be impactful in one city, and that's the city of the team that wins it, who will try and ignore the fact that it's a mirage, it's fake, it was a mini series, it was conducted under extraordinarily unique circumstances, and should never, ever, ever be compared to any other championship. There is a process that we are all used to in all sports. To be a champion, you have to go through this process. This is how we do things. And at the end of the day, the NHL, in a cockamamie way, and the NBA, in an equally cockamamie way, will have finished their, in essence, full regular season and go into a full playoff format of some sort. And so the comparison between this year's champions in those sports and previous might be valid. It has no validity in baseball. It will be celebrated only by the team that wins, and the other 29 cities will be bitching and complaining, and they're the ones that are going to hang up the asterisk. Whether it's in a record book or not, they're going to say, well, that team that won, okay, they won, but, it wasn't real. So, look, I got to tell you, I think that's the positive truth. Shannon, jump in.
Bob, they're saying that now with Houston anyway. I mean, they're saying it wasn't real anyway. I mean, whether it was an asterisk.
Well, that's enough. You're right, but that's another conversation. I mean, I can sit here, and we haven't had this conversation, the three of us, but at some point maybe we will. Just to put my 2 cents in on it. Did the Astros cheat? Yes. Has every other team in Major League Baseball been cheating for 50 years? Maybe not with the technology that they used. The answer is hell yes. From guys taking grease out to the mound in their glove, to putting nail files inside their glove and sawing the baseball before they throw it, to stealing signs from second base or the outfield or someplace else. Like, this kind of shit has gone on for a long, long time. And the Astros deserve to be punished. But there's a point here where you got to say, okay, let's not get too bent out of shape.
Well,
a couple of other things here.
No,
I don't want. We got about 7 minutes.
No, before you go, the one thing is that the pandemic has taken a lot of pressure off the Astros. I think our focus is everywhere else except what the Astros. If we were in a regular Major League Baseball season and the Astros, they would have been ambushed in every town they went to, and they still might.
What sport do you think doesn't make it through this? What sport has to shut down because there's too many tests? I know it's just a guess, but JP, Morosi, you don't think any of them, right?
It's a great question. It's impossible to know. I think that with baseball, I am optimistic that they're going to find a way to get this through. I really believe that. And I think the one thing about October and this is where the trust has to come in from MLB and the union, is that once you get to October, we've heard Dr. Fauci say here in the U.S. that he would have advised the season concluding by September. And so that means to me that October, if it's difficult in multiple cities around the U.S., that having a centralized, more of the pod, the bubble, however you want to call it, that we've seen with the NHL and NBA, that could become a reality for baseball. So I do think there is a pretty decent chance that we'll see the commissioner have to centralize the playoffs at some point in time. And I'm optimistic that somewhere in North America, that it's going to be safe to play those games in October. And I think it's just going to be a matter of really trusting and being nimble in finding that best location wherever it is, whether it's a big city or a small city, for baseball to find some way to finish their season in the month of October.
Shannon.
If you had to pick one, I'm going to pick the NBA. The two things, and it's the same for hockey right now. It's this training camp time that's going to be the measure. A good example in the National Hockey League, there are 744 players that are going to go to the tournament. But right now, as of last Monday, there was only 356 that have been tested. So players coming from Europe, traveling between Canada and the United States now, there's still almost 400 players that have to be tested before they can start training camp. We're going to know a lot more in the next 2 weeks for both basketball and for hockey. And then you wonder, I think the amount of regular season games that the NBA is still going to try to finish, I think that will be a challenge as well.
All right, last point. Trying to handicap what happens from here on in. Basketball is, 80%, 90% through its schedule. Hockey, similarly. They're going to finish up. That'll be more or less like a training camp, actual game training camp. And then they'll get to the playoffs. And so you can make the argument that the best team, by the time the Stanley Cup final rolls around, behind the NBA finals roll around, the best team might still be the best team. Can you do that in baseball? Can we even presume that the team that wins this thing in a season that is less than half its normal length is actually going to be the best team? And I'm not talking about theorizing this like I was previously. I'm talking about actual, do you have to be the best team to win, or do you just have to get hot? Because JP, we've seen teams have great first halves and fall apart in the second half, and vice versa. And it happens almost every year. Really what you're talking about over 60 games and then plus, 10, 15 in the postseason, just get hot and you can win this thing. Yes or no?
Well, consider last year, Bob. The Washington Nationals were well below 500 after 60 games, and their season turned out just fine in the end. So we can see a similar circumstance this year where maybe a surprise team ends up winning. I still believe the best roster in the game belongs to the Dodgers, and they would have been the best team over 162. I still think they're the best team over 60. Even without David Price, they've got still tremendous rotation depth. Brusdar Graterol, Dustin May, Tony Gonsolin. They've got tremendous depth, even from an offensive standpoint. And who would have thought that here we are having this conversation about baseball in 2020 and the DH becoming standardized. It has taken this long to get into the conversation. Just tells you how many things are at work here. And the DH for the Dodgers, they've got Jock Peterson. They can rotate Turner through that spot. Bellinger to get him a day off. They're just so deep and so good. Great manager in Dave Roberts. They're the best team to me. They're even better than the Yankees, I believe, overall. So if the best team wins, it's going to be the Dodgers. That being said, when you look at everything we've ever known about baseball and how random it can be, probably the Dodgers still have the best chance to win, and they have the best roster. But I would say their chances of winning are probably no higher than 35%, and the field's probably 65 at this point in time, because there's just so much randomness in the game. I mentioned this earlier, and I'll underscore it here. Young teams are dangerous because young teams are going to have that hunger and the edge. And if they get in as a wild card, a team like the Reds, the White Sox, even the Blue Jays, I could see a team that surprises people and is young and is playing with a lot of intensity, urgency. I love Cincinnati. That team is They've got Castellanos now, Moustakas, Luis Castillo. Remember that name, is one of the pitchers that I think is one of the best 10 in the game that no one still talks about. That is a really good team in a winnable division. It will not surprise me at all if we see the Cincinnati Reds playing in the NLCS or even the World Series this year.
You know, it's interesting, Bob, you talked about it. It's such a different mindset in baseball where normally it's a marathon, not a sprint. And now it's a complete sprint for 60 games. And the Nationals concept from last year is the best example. You can get a bunch of guys going and win a lot of those now almost completely within their own division and change the whole complexion so quickly and end up a team that we thought was going to be 10-20 is actually 20-10 halfway through the season. And now they've got a chance. It's going to be, it may be something that baseball is going to have to look at. Remember when minor league baseball used to have first half and second
season,
half
yeah,
champions?
First half champions, yeah.
And you know what? There was nothing wrong with it. I grew up watching in the PCL. They used to see it all the time. It was fantastic to know that your team, they weren't out of it, even in the second half if they were 20 games under 500 because they won the first half. It was fantastic.
Well, let me before we go, let me ask one other question because this comes to mind. Morosi, would you manage differently in a 60-game schedule, understanding the complexity of what you're going through, than you would if you were starting a season that was going to be 162? Do you let pitchers stay out there longer? Do you limit your rotation? Would you even consider going to a 4-man rotation if your 5th guy was crap? I mean, there are all kinds of little things that may become important in this mini season, for lack of a better term, than would normally be the case. What would you do? What do you expect to see?
Well, you definitely manage it differently. A couple things. I would look at the pitching side and say you begin the season with 30 players on the active roster, and it goes down to 28, then 26 in 2-week increments. I would need to see early. I would limit my starters in terms of their number of innings in their first couple times through the rotation. And I would need to get looks at my relievers. You don't want to have, guys, in this circumstance, a 30-man roster with additional relief pitchers and never use them. I really think from a standpoint of fairness, team chemistry, team harmony, not that you're giving out free appearances to pitchers, but if you've got a 30-player roster, you're going to need all of them. And you understand the likelihood of potentially positive tests down the line or injuries. The last thing you want to do is have someone on your 30-man roster and never use them because you're going to probably have to count on that person at some point in time down the line. So not that this is not recreational baseball for 14-year-olds here, but I really think it's important to involve your full roster, trust your players. They have been there with you. They have gone through these protocols. They're all major league players. They're all great players in their own right from a talent standpoint. You've got to trust them and you got to use them in these early games. You have to give them a chance to show what they can do. I think that's going to have positive effects on team chemistry and positive effects on the health of your team. You do not want to have your pitchers early on in the season going 7 innings right away. You've got a full rested bullpen. Let those guys pitch, and then you're going to be able to discern through that time who are going to be the really key guys that you're going to have to count on here as time goes forward. Because I would tell you this, guys, the names, the big names that you see on the roster may not necessarily be the players performing the best in these unique circumstances. You've got to give your players a chance to prove their value in a very unique set of circumstances.
Well, I want to throw it to Shannon. I want to throw it to you.
No, I got to ask you a question, Bob. With all the things about managing differently, do you manage differently late in the game when you've got not a great bullpen, when you know that you're going to extra innings and you got a guy starting on second base?
I manage differently completely, and I totally disagree with Morosi, which will shock you. I'm going to ride the horses that I have the most confidence in as hard as I can, as long as I can. Now, the exception might be starting pitching. And yes, at the beginning of the year, you're going to have to phase these guys in. And that'll take at least 2 weeks, 3 weeks maybe. But when push comes to shove, I am taking no chances. I got some 21, 22-year-old snot-nosed puke who has been playing at Albuquerque for the last couple of years, and he's on my roster because I got an expanded roster. His ass is glued to the bench. I am taking no chance. There is no way I'm not playing. I'm playing my A-list guys as hard as I can, as long as I can.
Hey, hold on, Bob. You'd go with Whitey Ford every time if you could.
Yeah, well, yes, and Sandy Koufax and Juan Marichal and let me think, who else?
Veterans, you'd be just play with the veterans. That's all you'd want to do all the time.
Well, I don't want any snot-nosed, pimply-faced kids out on the mound in a 60-game season. Now, Morosi, I know you have the complete opposite opinion, right?
I do, and here's the thing: we're going to have to be prepared to be surprised this year. We're not going to see necessarily, as someone, actually a player told me in the last several days, someone that no one is talking about right now is going to win the MVP or the Cy Young. We have to be able to differentiate between the big name players, the all-stars that we know well, and those who are playing best right now. And the reason why I think you're going to have to use your full bench, your full bullpen, is you're not going to know until the games begin who is actually playing the best in 2020. And a lot of those adjustments that we see made during a postseason series, being quick about adjustments, every game is worth almost 3. So if you have a 3-game losing streak, it's like a 9-game losing streak. Adjustments are going to have to come quickly. And without really having more than a handful of exhibition games, you're simply not going to know who your best players are until you see them performing in the games that really matter.
Guys, we're kind of out of time here, although we can sit and chat for hours as we have done in the past and probably will do in the future. Morosi, good to see you. Thanks a lot, pal, for taking a few minutes down the road, if it's okay with you. Thank you.
Sounds great. It was a lot of fun, and I love the conversation, even though I do see that Ohio State Buckeyes sign behind you, Bob. It was put there, I think, very, very tactfully. I see it. It's not huge, so I respect it, and we look forward to the next conversation.
Well, and what I see behind you is a bunch of your artwork that you probably did last night, and I don't think it has any
spent all day on it.
It looks like a bunch of 4 or 5-year-olds did it. Oh, maybe they did. Shannon.
JP, there's nothing tactful about Ohio State Buckeye football, okay? Nothing. So don't even suggest it that anything like that's going to happen.
Trying to be gracious to the host,
matters at the end of the day, and Morosi knows when that one happens. And I'll be calling him after the one this November, too, assuming.
Or maybe not.
Or maybe not, I guess. For John Shannon, JP Morosi, Bob McCown, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.